29th of August, 1944. Heat shimmers above the Caliche road. Otto steps down from the flatbed at the ranch gate, dust on his boots, a clipboard in his hand. He is a German prisoner of war, the lead man on a work detachment. He counts his men as they climb off, notes the guard's pencil on the tally, and keeps them in pairs so the day stays quiet. The branch camp routine sits in his head like rails. Roll call, transport, field hours, pay and canteen credit, Red Cross parcels, and the Geneva rules that set the limits. His goal is simple because it must be: finish the rows, keep the crew safe, get back in time to trade script for soap and stamps. From the porch he sees a family under a tin awning, the smell of beans and coffee drifting across the yard. A child waves, and the guard shifts his stance. Otto nods once and looks to the fields, because he knows the line here is thin, and an open door at a ranch house can be both kindness and risk. Before dawn, the truck had waited under the floodlights by the wire. Otto stood with his clipboard at the end of the line while the sergeant at the gate checked armbands and tags. He had counted 16 men twice. The corporal read the day's limits in slow English, and Otto caught the parts that mattered. Stay in sight, no house, tools only, Sunday hours, back by late afternoon. He watched the corporal's finger as it moved down the typed list, because the finger made the English clear. Head nods passed down the line, and the pencil ticked the head count on a card. He kept his goal plain in his mind so the men could hold it too. Work clean, no talk that draws eyes, no argument about task assignments. If they stayed in good standing, they kept the Sunday detail and the canteen coupons that came with it. If any man tried a shortcut or wandered, they would lose both. The Geneva rules he knew by habit now, from the lectures and the Red Cross posters by the mess hall door. They got token pay in scrip. They could not be sent to dangerous work or handled by civilians. They could send letters, 2 a month if they kept them brief. The parcels had come the day before, and he had moved fast to save the chocolate and a thin sheet of writing paper before sweat and dust touched them. The ride was the same as other weeks. A stake-bed truck with slats high enough to take a bump without sending a man over, water cans lashed to the side, a rack of shovels and mattocks tied with wire. Otto checked the handles as the tools were passed up, felt a hairline split under his thumb on one shovel, and made a note on his clipboard. He gave that one to the lightest task, because a crack could take skin off a palm or send a man off balance. Private James Valdez climbed in after them, his Springfield across his knees, the corporal up front in the cab with the driver. The road took gray light, and the men held the rails as oaks and fence posts passed. At the ranch gate the truck braked and the tires spit dust. Cedar posts ran down the lane like ribs. A windmill head turned with a steady chop and threw a thin shadow on the packed earth. Hooves set dust drifting at the far fence line. A white dog trotted, watched, and kept its distance. The corporal repeated the rules at the gate in the same plain voice, and Otto watched the dry hand lift as each point came, then drop. No entering the house. No gifts or trades. No alcohol. No walking out of the sight lines. The family stood back on the porch, and Otto measured the space with his eye. The line was the gate to the trough and across to the barn, nothing more. He put the cracked shovel on ditch clearing and the sound ones on post holes. He paired men who worked well in silence and set the 2 talkers where Valdez could see them, because watchful eyes kept their jokes short. When the rancher pointed to a broken fence near the bullpen, Otto waited for the corporal to nod before he sent anyone near it. They kept to hand tools. No tractors, no belts or chain drives, no climbing on ladders without a guard close. The Sunday detail meant lighter hours, not lighter care. He matched each man to a task he could finish before the windmill shadow shortened to noon. Valdez's tone walked the line with them. He checked the water cans before any tool left the rack. He stood where the men could see him, but not at their backs. When a hat blew against the wire and one man moved toward it, Otto lifted one finger and the man stopped. Valdez did not have to speak. That small stop gave Otto a measure of trust to build on. During the first break, Valdez unstrapped his pocket watch and glanced at it, and Otto followed his eyes to the angle of the windmill shadow on the ground. He began to count the morning in the way the shadow swung, and in the way the guard's hands moved at the quarters. The baseball diamond lay chalk pale in a corner of the pasture, lines of lime burned into the grass, a rough square, a plank for home. Otto stored it as a plan, not a promise. If the fence mending went well and the ditch ran clean to the trough by early afternoon, he would ask, in the open and with the corporal within earshot, if the men could play a short game before loading up. He would put the men who needed watching on the outfield, where they were farthest from the lane and closest to Valdez. The idea had a simple use. A game filled the hour before the truck and ate the restlessness that could turn into trouble. At noon they stood in a narrow strip of shade cast by the water tank, and the white dog circled and lay down beyond it with a deliberate show of distance. Otto took a swallow, wiped his hands on his trousers, and took out the thin red cross sheet. He did not unfold it. The paper had to stay clean if it was to reach his mother with his small list of proofs. He was alive, he had work, he was paid in coupons, he had saved chocolate, he hoped she had potatoes. He felt the square of chocolate in his pocket and thought, for a second, of the child on the porch. The rules about gifts were clear. He let the thought pass and decided to split it among the crew instead at lights out. A broken rule for kindness could cost them the detail. A kept rule could still make room for courtesy. The afternoon moved in the way of work that counts minutes. He checked the crack in the shovel twice more and then pulled it from use before it failed. He traded it for a hoe that could be pushed with two hands. He saw the windmill shadow reach the trough and then slide past. The men moved slower, but they did not drag. Valdez's watch came out again, and Otto matched the angle with the march of tasks left. When the rancher came out with a tin dipper and held it by the handle toward the men, he did it where the guards could see. Otto nodded and brought the men up one by one. Clear rules made space for that measured act. Everyone held the same picture in their heads, and the dipper passed like a tool. When a gust sent a straw hat flying over the fence into the pasture, one of the younger men stepped without thinking. Otto caught his sleeve and pulled him back into the line. The guard's hand shifted on the rifle and then went still. Otto felt the thinness of the path again, and the way a small misstep made it thinner. He marked the young man for center field if the game came. He took one last look at the lime lines under the sun, and weighed the work done against the risk of asking. If the ditch ran without a snag and the post stood straight, if the tools went back clean and no one had strayed, he would ask the corporal in open view. The plan was simple and safe, because it stayed inside the things already allowed. By the time the truck's shadow reached the gate again, Otto had his small list of wins for the day. No slips, no cuts, no harsh words from the corporal, fence tight, ditch clear, everyone within the line. He held the paper still folded and unmarked in his shirt pocket and felt the square of chocolate against it. If lights out came on time, he would write to his mother and tell her about Sunday work under a turning windmill, about pay in little orange coupons, about guards who watched but did not bait them. What they could keep would come from this kind of day. Because the rules were strict and clear, he could see the narrow, safe path for courtesy with the ranchers, as long as it stayed in the open under the eyes that counted. He set the crew on the south fence where the wire sagged between cedar posts. For the pull, he paired men by height, so the line would rise even, and not make a sawtooth that would draw a rancher's complaint or a guard's question. Two taller men took the come-along and the shorter pair held the splice. Otto watched the barbs catch sun and chose his steps to keep hands clear. He kept the tampers in the shade until the wire ran straight, then sent two men to pack earth around the fresh-set posts in slow, steady strokes so the head stayed level. Even work read as safe work. Safe work kept the morning out of the guard's nerves. The heat pressed flat on the grass by mid-morning, so he broke the crew in small blocks instead of all at once. Two men into the narrow strip of shade, then a swap every few minutes, always with tools left where Valdez could see them. Because the breaks were staggered, no one line went still, and the guard did not have to pace. It let the water cans last, and kept the men's hands from slipping when they pulled wire to the splice sleeves. A young man started to take a full hat off and fan himself. Otto shook his head and showed him how to lift the brim with 2 fingers and breathe through the band. Little lessons cut risk when the sun made people careless. When the last splice set, he heard the screen door creak and looked up. The rancher's wife stood in the doorway with a tin dipper and a row of cups set on a tray. The screen fluttered back, and in the dark room beyond a radio murmured. Otto caught only a few English words, surrender and Pacific, bent by static. He lined those words up with other words he knew from camp bulletins about exchanges and moves and thought, without letting it change his face. That shifts in far-off fights could move the schedules that would decide who left when. Because that thought brought risk close, he tightened himself to the present and the rules he could control. He kept his eyes on the boundary between porch and yard. She said her name slow, Mrs. Sloane, and pointed to herself with a small nod to make it clear. Otto gave his own name and kept his hands by his sides. When he said he had been a machinist, she glanced to the side of the door and touched a loose hinge where the pin had drifted up and left the screen to rasp. She made a question with her eyebrows more than words. He did not move to the porch. He turned to Valdez and asked in slow English if he could set the pin right here, where everyone could see. He tapped his chest, pointed to the hinge, kept his boots in dust, and held up 2 fingers to show it would take only a minute. In his head he saw a line of cause and effect. If he asked the guard and not the rancher, he showed respect for the chain that mattered. Valdez took a breath while his fingers shifted on the rifle sling. He gave one small nod. Otto called for the pliers from the wire roll, stepped only far enough to reach the hinge without mounting the step, and used the flat jaws to pinch the split pin back round. He kept the screen between himself and the doorway, and he talked each move aloud for Valdez to hear. Bend, press, set. The rasping stopped. Mrs. Sloane's mouth set in a line that read as thanks. She set the tin cups on the top step where the guard could watch them and backed her weight to the hinge once to test it. The rancher came up after that, hat low and dust on his cuffs. He looked to the fence, then to the men under the tank, and his face softened. "Sunday supper," he says with a half-smile dramatized, and he pointed to a broad pecan where an extra table stood under light shade. The word supper sat warm in the air, but the corporal's boots sounded on the packed dirt before anyone moved. He reminded all what had been said at the gate. Prisoners may take meals only under supervision, no entering the house, no taking gifts or money, no private talk out of sight. Otto saw the risk lines as plainly as the lime chalk by the pasture. He thought of the Red Cross sheet by his bunk and the camp bulletin that had warned. Write no names of employers, no addresses, no details that read as friendship. He held the two pictures side by side, an open table and a set of rules, and began to draft a safe way through. He proposed it piece by piece, simple and slow so the guard could weigh each point. The men would sit at a separate table outside, on the far side of the pecan, with the tools stacked in a neat row between the tables so nothing looked hidden. The guards would stand or sit between the two tables, in line with the road. No one would step on the porch or into the house. The food would be served and cleared under the same eyes that watched the fence. The time would be 1 hour only. Before anyone touched a plate, hands would be washed at the yard spigot in open view. He added a small extra. The hats would stay on the bench while they ate so no one needed to lift a hand to his head when a car passed. Because the lane lay open to the road, he placed one steady man to rinse cups and watch the gate at the same time, and to speak up if dust showed where the lane met the main track. Valdez still looked tight across the shoulders, so Otto brought the talk to ground he had already measured. He pointed with his chin to the rough diamond by the pasture and said that after they ate, if there was time, some men could take positions in the open where guards liked to see them. Valdez rubbed his thumb on the sling and, after a pause, said he played shortstop back in San Antonio. Otto answered that he had played third in Bremen, not with a boast but as a map to a safe subject they both knew. The words turned Valdez's mouth a shade lighter. The corporal watched the exchange, then looked to the road, then to the tables. He set the conditions a second time and checked his watch. The plan held because it lived inside the rules and showed itself in plain sight. Otto signaled the man at the spigot and pointed to the gate. He moved the tool row so it formed a line between the pecan table and the porch, and kept the cracked shovel on top to remind himself not to forget it later. He said the hour aloud and touched his watch face to set its weight. When the first plates came out, stacked and plain, he counted his men across to the far table and saw Valdez choose a place between the two groups where he could see faces and the road at once. He felt the tension settle a notch. The meal would be measured, and it would be watched, because he had made it fit the rules that would let all of them go back through the gate at day's end. They ate in the open where the tree made shade that moved slow. The prisoners sat at a side trestle under the pecan. The guards took the end, where they could see the road and both tables. The ranch family stayed by the porch table. The doorway stayed shut. Plates and bowls crossed only the gap of air, hand to hand, never over the step. Cornbread came first, split by hand so it did not crumble. Beans with salt pork set a heavy smell that fit the heat. Sliced roast lay on a platter that gleamed with fat. The tea was cold and brown and tasted of iron and sweetness. Otto felt it touch the back of his throat and held his face still. He said thanks in slow English so the men did not reach too far with their own words. No one rose. No one put a boot on the step. He kept his eyes on the lane and counted minutes with the shadow from the limb on the table edge. Light talk found a path across the space because it did not need many words. The rancher's boy stood by the rail and lifted his foot to show a scuffed ball, and one of the older Germans traced lines in the dust with a finger to explain the offside rule from soccer: 2 defenders and a line that lives in movement. The boy watched the lines and nodded, then ran the same path in the dust with his own shoe. Laughter rose once, quick and round, and then the radio inside the house gave a hymn that slid through the screen. The men went quiet as if called. Otto watched the guard at the end of the bench. The man's jaw slackened for a breath, then said again when a truck sound came and faded on the far road. The song pulled and then let go. Otto filed the sign away. Holiday edges are soft, but the road decides. He worked the hour the way he worked a fence line, small checks and clear signals. Before bowls were refilled, he pointed the men to the spigot in pairs and showed them how to stand so the guards could see the water run over their hands. If a spoon fell, he told the man to leave it until Mrs. Sloane set a clean one on the step. He reminded the talkers to face the guard when they spoke. He tasted the tea again and thought for a blink of his mother's tin cup and the dull taste of city pipes in Bremen, then shut that door because the present needed both eyes. He kept the cracked shovel on top of the tool row as a marker, a memory he could touch so nothing useful was left behind when the hour closed. Dishes were lifted and carried to the yard sink with slow care, and no crossing of the porch line. A pan of warm water sat on a crate, and one man rinsed while another dried with a clean towel that went back to the top step when finished. When the plates were stacked and the cups hung, Valdez glanced to the pasture. The chalk lines were thin and rough, but they held. A short game would fit the minutes left, and it would keep men in open sight. Otto counted off positions with a small wave of the hand and placed the most restless in the wide outfield where nothing pressed. He took a bat with a smooth handle that would not shear skin. Valdez tossed him the ball underhand once to feel the reach. The first pitch came in soft. Otto stepped, sawdust lift off his boot, and sent a dribbler up the third base line. It did not travel far, but it moved the men, and that was enough. Cheers rose and stopped in the same breath, like a wave that breaks and pulls back without spray. He watched Valdez look at his hands and then at the way Otto held the bat. The guard closed the distance by 2 steps and turned his own hands to show a grip that brought the knuckles into line and set the wrists loose. His fingers did not touch Otto, but the shape was clear. Then he took the steps back fast, as if a wire had hummed. Otto reset his hands and felt the wood sit better. He held the small lesson like a tool and stacked it next to the memory of the hinge fixed at the door. The next swing sent the ball in a soft arc to shallow right, and a man who needed it most ran hard and laughed once without sound. Otto saw the time on Valdez's watch and called the last play with a lift of his chin. The tools went back to the rack in the order he had made in the morning. The ride back carried fewer words. Heat and food slowed the men and took the edge off their shoulders. Red dust rose from the lane and settled on their boots, on the cuffs of trousers, on the fold of the Red Cross paper in Otto's pocket. He kept one hand on the tool rack so the jolt of a rut would not throw a handle loose. The radio's hymn stayed in his head, not as a tune, but as a bar of clean sound. He counted his men at the gate with the same steady pace as the morning. The pencil ticked the card. The wire closed behind them with its dull, metallic note. In the barracks, the evening was a square of light at the table, and the smell of soap where the men had washed. Otto sat with the 25-line form and a pen that scratched. He printed plain. He put no unit number, no rank, no place. He wrote that he was well, that work on Sunday had been outside, that a family had shared a meal under a tree. He named no names and gave no directions. He described cornbread, beans with pieces of pork, and a slice of roast because food is a safe shape on paper. He wrote that the tea was cold and tasted sweet. He said that after food, the men had moved around a small field and hit a ball with a piece of wood. He did not say who tossed to him. He did not mark the guard by name or place. He looked at the margin and thought of drawing a little diamond with 4 dots for the bases. He saw the corporal's finger on the rule sheet in his head and stopped his hand before the pen moved. He checked the lines again and took out any word that could read as a place or a person. He kept only the hour's fact. People sat in the shade and shared a plate, and left the rest to home to fill. He folded the sheet so the crease fell between lines and did not cut a word in half. He wrote Bremen, his mother's street, the number, and kept the letters round so a clerk's eye would not snag. At the mail slot, the lamp made a small pool over the wooden box. A guard sat by it with a book and a pencil. Otto felt the weight of his own sheet between finger and thumb. Because he had kept the lines vague and kind, and because he had put no hooks for the censor to catch, he believed the paper might travel. It would carry the shape of a table in the sun, and the sound of a screen door that opened and closed without fear, and it would tell its small truth without naming anyone who had been brave enough to pass a bowl across a gap of air. Formation called them out after supper and set them in rows that ran straight to the floodlights. The sergeant read from a clipboard. Words fell into groups that Otto could sort. Designated units, staging camps, transfer in days, lists to be posted. He kept his face still while his name and his detail were read in a block bound for a place used to sort men before they moved again. Relief came first because forward motion ended waiting. Right behind it came a small loss for the clean path he had just found. Truck at dawn, fence by noon, a game that used up the last hour under open eyes. Because departure had moved from rumor to schedule, the ground under those habits shifted. Inside the mess, a new sheet had been tacked to the board with fresh thumbprints around the corners. He read the print line by line. During demobilization, it said, prisoners would not exchange gifts, notes, or personal items with civilians. No tokens, no addresses, no promises. The heading named it a temporary measure to protect order. The type was dark, and even as if the machine itself wanted no doubt. The rule did not change what had been forbidden before, but it tightened the net. It told him that what had fit inside permission last Sunday now sat under a narrower sky. The memory of plates passed through air did not break the rule. The future did. At the gate the next morning, Valdez stood square with his rifle high and his mouth tight. He checked tags with a voice that carried only numbers and last names. He said nothing about the back grip or the shallow right field. He pointed to the truck bed with a flat palm and gave no small talk to fill the space. Otto matched that tone and kept his men quiet. He raised his clipboard so the light fell on the names, and he counted them off with the same neatness he had used all summer. Because orders had moved closer, the guard's own path had contracted until there was no room left for extra words. In that clean, spare lane, trust was measured in visible steps and timed glances, not in shared hints. They went back to the ranch once more under that new sign. The windmill turned and dust rose as before, but the porch stayed dim. The boy's glove had sat on Otto's shelf overnight, oiled and tied with twine, so the pocket would hold its shape. He did not take it in his hand when the truck stopped. He held it by the laces and lifted it to Valdez at the gate, palms open, fingers apart, so there was no doubt. Valdez took the glove, carried it forward himself, and set it on the top step without crossing the screen. The boy reached through the mesh and pulled it in. Mrs. Sloane stood behind the screen as a darker shape in dark light. She raised one hand, flat and level, and held it a breath, then let it fall. The door did not swing. The screen did not thrum. Because the sheet at the mess had fixed the boundary, every act of courtesy now had to pass through a guard's hands to be clean. Work finished early so the truck could make a second run for another crew. In the yard, Otto took his last look at the tool row, and at the cracked shovel he had kept on top as a memory to mind small risks. He lifted it into the rack and felt a dull pride that no one had bled on his watch. When the corporal called "load up," he did not look back at the pecan. He put his boot on the running board and counted his men as they climbed. He held the desire to wave down in his shoulder because this was not a place for mixed signals. The hour that had opened on Sunday had a lid now. He would not test the seal. Packing began with the small, private order a man can still make for himself. He rolled his second pair of socks inside out to keep the seams smooth, and tucked the slip that proved his last letter had passed the censor into the cuff. He slid his spare canteen coupon under his bunkmate's pillow with a soft knock on the wood, so the man would know to look. The bunkmate would be months behind the line of men who would go first. The coupon would buy soap or a tin of fruit. The act cost him almost nothing, and it kept his own pack lighter. He set aside one shirt he would not need and mended a loose button on the other, so he did not look ragged at the transit camp where first glances mattered. On the shelf sat the flattened wrapper from his Red Cross parcel, the one with his mother's street written in ink that had not bled. He had saved it because it held the curve of her address in a way that the camp forms did not. He ran a finger down the crease and felt the ridge where it had been folded against chocolate. He could not carry Texas in any way that customs or guards would allow. No pebble, no dust. Only a line on paper and a mind's picture of shade that turned with the sun. He slid the wrapper into the flat of his kit under his spare shirt where it would not crumple. At lights out, talk ran soft over the bunks in a chain of names they had heard and guessed at. Ports on maps they had cleaned with rags. Ships named by men who had worked the docks before the war, rail hubs that belonged more to rumor than to tickets. Boston, New York, a camp with a number in the hills, a pier with cranes that looked like praying mantises against a gray sky. Otto listened and did not add. He knew how lists worked. He knew that cues and numbers moved bodies and that men did not jump lines by hoping. He held his words back because what he could claim now was small. A place on a roster, a date that would shift when another list landed, a bag that he could lift himself. When the call came to form by barracks, he laced his boots tight and checked his kit by touch. He looked once more at the board by the mess. The ban on exchanges lay there in the same square of paper, corners curled now from fingers that had read it. It had changed little and changed everything. Because departure had a timetable, the human space that had opened at the pecan table had narrowed to official distance. The camp had not turned cold, it had turned exact. In that narrowness, the same rules that had made room for a measured kindness now closed that room so the next moves could happen without noise. He walked to the gate and saw Valdez in place, cap low, belt set high, the rifle a clean line. They met eyes a moment. Valdez gave the smallest nod allowable inside his lane. Otto gave the smallest one back. It was enough. He stepped onto the truck when his name was called and felt the boards under his soles, not the field. He learned that an hour can hold more than a rule book and less than a promise, and that both can be true in the same hand. When the convoy rolled and the fence slid past, he carried forward a memory that needed no address. Beyond the lists and the ships and the ports, it would be the part of the war that left Texas with him and reached the place where numbers were counted into peace. As he stepped onto the boards and the convoy moved, the shared meal had already changed how the day sat in his head. The guard's watch and the rancher's porch were still lines to mind, but inside them an earned kindness could live without breaking the frame. Orders and the new sheet drew those lines tight again. The glove passed only through a guard's hands. The door stayed behind its screen, and his signals stayed small and clean so nothing would be lost. He kept the wrapper, the letter, and one steady thought. An hour one in open sight can travel farther than a parcel because it needs no label to pass. As the lists pulled them toward ports and ships and the road out, he carried the shade of that pecan with his kit. When the ocean lay between Texas and the place where numbers are counted into peace, that hour would still be his. And as the ships took men home in rows, a Sunday table under a Texas pecan became part of what they took back that no inspection could seize.